The air inside the hearing room didn't just hum, it crackled. It felt like every camera lens, every phone screen, every restless whisper was waiting for something to break. And then it did. Stephen Miller leaned forward with that practiced sneer, the kind of look that has silenced so many before. His words came out sharp, smug, drenched in condescension. He thought this was his arena. He thought he could humiliate Jasmine Crockett the same way he had bulldozed through countless others. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. Instead, she met him with a silence so heavy it turned the entire room against him. Reporters froze mid-scribble. Staffers glanced at one another. Even the cameras seemed to wait. It was the silence of control, the silence of someone who knows the weight of her truth is heavier than any insult a man like Miller could throw. And in that silence, you could almost hear arrogance begin to unravel. Miller, sensing the attention slipping, pushed harder. His tone grew sharper, his voice rising with the bravado of a man convinced volume could make up for emptiness. He wanted dominance. He wanted the clip that would go viral, the one where Jasmine Crockett stumbled, where dignity bent under pressure. But every word he threw only widened the chasm, because Crockett wasn't rattled. She was composed, poised, letting him reveal exactly who he was, a bully dressing up cruelty as intelligence. And then she struck. Her first words sliced through his performance with precision, cutting past the bluster and hitting the raw nerve he had tried to hide. They weren't loud. They didn't need to be. They carried the power of truth wrapped in calm, and the effect was seismic. Miller's smirk faltered just for a flicker. Gasps rippled through the room. The live feed chat boxes lit up with fire emojis and disbelief. Suddenly, the predator looked cornered. This wasn't politics as usual. This was cinematic. It was the kind of moment that electrifies a nation, that makes strangers text each other links before the exchange is even over. For the first time in his carefully choreographed career, Stephen Miller looked exposed. And yet, as powerful as that moment was, it was only the spark. What came next would not just rattle the room. It would tear through headlines, explode across social media, and leave Stephen Miller wishing he had never opened his mouth. Because Jasmine Crockett wasn't there to survive him. She was there to dismantle him. Understand the electricity of that chamber. You have to understand why this moment mattered so much. This wasn't just another routine hearing, another exchange of talking points for tomorrow's headlines. This was Stephen Miller, Donald Trump's ideological architect, the man who had built his reputation on targeting immigrants, on twisting fear into policy, on treating human dignity like an inconvenience. He walked into that room, certain it would be another easy performance. He had played this role countless times. The intellectual bully, the smirking tactician, the self-anointed genius who believed compassion was weakness. And across from him sat Jasmine Crockett, a woman who represented the very America Miller tried to erase. Her story was not of privilege, not of entitlement, but of struggle, grit, and relentless resilience. She wasn't supposed to rise in Miller's world. She wasn't supposed to belong at the table he thought he owned. Yet here she was, face to face with the man who embodied the arrogance of an old order clinging to power. And the stakes? They couldn't have been higher. Because this was not about one insult. This was about what America would choose to be. On one side sat the embodiment of exclusion, a man whose entire career thrived on dividing people by race, by origin, by worth. On the other sat the embodiment of defiance against that exclusion, a woman whose very presence challenged his ideology, whose voice threatened to dismantle his carefully polished facade. As Miller leaned into his attack, his arrogance filled the room like smoke. His words dripped with contempt, meant to belittle, meant to frame Crockett as unworthy. He wanted the cameras to capture her frustration, her stumble, her fall. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't playing his game. She knew this wasn't just about her. It was about every immigrant family watching from their living rooms. It was about every child of color who had been told they didn't belong. It was about every working-class American who had been trampled under the boot of power dressed up as policy. And that's why the silence hit so hard. That's why her calm unnerved him. In that quiet, she shifted the entire balance. Miller's bluster started to look desperate. His sneer started to look strained. The villain was revealing himself without even realizing it. What the audience didn't know yet, what they were about to witness, was that this exchange wouldn't just be about a clash of personalities. It would be about truth colliding with propaganda, dignity standing against arrogance, and a single voice reminding the nation that power doesn't always belong to the loudest person in the room. Already, whispers were spreading. Clips of the first moments were being tweeted, reshared, dissected. She's not intimidated. Look at his face. Finally, someone standing up to him. The stakes were no longer confined to four walls. The confrontation was spilling out, bleeding into the national bloodstream, pulling in millions of eyes who didn't even know they needed this showdown until now. And as Miller pressed harder, doubling down with the arrogance of a man who believed he could not lose, the stage was being set. He thought he was tightening the noose around Crockett. What he didn't realize was that he was building the scaffold beneath his own feet. Because the next words out of Jasmine Crockett's mouth weren't just going to defend her. They were going to redefine the fight entirely. And when they landed, the entire nation would feel the aftershocks. Stephen Miller did not stumble into this moment by accident. His entire career had been building toward it, brick by brick, policy by policy, headline by headline. To his followers, he was the quiet architect behind the curtain, the man who could distill cruelty into legislation and disguise it as patriotism. To his critics, he was the face of a darker America, the one that saw immigrants not as people, but as problems, the one that weaponized fear to keep power clutched in the same few hands. From his earliest days in politics, Miller understood one thing: outrage is a currency. He mastered it with precision. He was the man who drafted speeches that turned compassion into a weakness. He was the advisor whispering behind closed doors, pushing travel bans, family separations, policies that left scars not just on paper, but on real human lives. And he loved it. The power, the headlines, the feeling of pulling strings while others danced. This was the world Miller thrived in. Yet his arrogance was not just political. It was personal. He carried himself with the certainty of a man who believed history itself would bend to his will. Every sneer in that hearing room wasn't just about Jasmine Crockett. It was about a lifetime of believing he was untouchable. He had walked into countless rooms before, silenced opponents with sheer venom, and walked out unscathed. Why should this day be any different? But the cracks were always there, because beneath the carefully crafted facade of intellect and strategy lay something far simpler: fear. Fear that his vision of America, a vision rooted in exclusion and division, was slipping away. Fear that voices like Jasmine Crockett's were no longer the exceptions, but the future. And fear, above all, that history would remember him not as an architect, but as a villain. That's what made his performance in this moment so desperate. Every line he delivered carried not just arrogance, but panic disguised as confidence. He attacked Crockett not because she was weak, but because she was strong in ways he could not control. Her presence at that table was living proof that his worldview was cracking. And the louder he grew, the more obvious it became that he was fighting a losing war against inevitability. To the audience watching, Miller's arrogance might have seemed rehearsed, even predictable. But to those who knew his history, it was chillingly familiar. They had seen this pattern before. The condescension, the smirk, the sharpened words meant to slice dignity down to size. They had seen how his rhetoric could turn into policies that shattered families, how his sneer could ripple into deportations, raids, shattered dreams. This wasn't just a man in a room. It was the living embodiment of policies that scarred a nation. And that's why his unraveling mattered so deeply. This wasn't just Stephen Miller, the political operative, losing his grip. This was the ideology of fear itself, starting to collapse under the weight of truth. Every falter in his voice, every crack in his expression was a symbol. The architect of cruelty meeting a wall he could not bulldoze. Still, in that moment, Miller believed he could win. He believed his smirk could erase Crockett's calm. He believed his sneer could outshine her dignity. But arrogance has a way of blinding men to their downfall. He didn't realize the ground was already shifting beneath him. The more he tried to dominate, the more the contrast sharpened. He was the villain on full display, and the audience didn't need to be told. They could feel it. And while Miller thought he was writing another chapter of dominance, what he was really doing was setting the stage for a cinematic reversal. Because villains don't just fall in silence, they fall spectacularly. And when Jasmine Crockett finally delivered her counterattack, it wouldn't just expose Miller. It would expose everything he stood for. What Miller didn't know, and what the audience was about to see, was that the story of this day wasn't about him holding power. It was about him losing it. Jasmine Crockett did not arrive at this moment by accident. Her journey was not paved with privilege, not handed down by connections or legacy. It was carved through grit, sacrifice, and the kind of battles most people never see. Born into a world that often underestimated women who looked like her, Jasmine learned early that silence was a luxury she could never afford. Every step forward meant proving doubters wrong, not once, not twice, but over and over again. She grew up watching communities pushed to the margins, people treated as statistics rather than human beings. And rather than turning away, she leaned into the struggle. Law was not just a career for her. It was a lifeline for those who had none. In courtrooms, in neighborhoods, in late-night strategy sessions, Jasmine built her reputation not on wealth or power, but on courage. She became the advocate for the voiceless, the defender for the ignored. That is what made this hearing so much more than political theater. For Jasmine, sitting across from Stephen Miller wasn't just about policy, it was about legacy. She carried into that room the weight of every immigrant family who had been told they didn't belong, every young girl who had been told she wasn't enough, every working mother who had been forced to fight twice as hard for half as much. Her presence was a living contradiction to the narrative Miller had spent his life advancing. But Jasmine's strength wasn't just in her story. It was in how she wore it. Calm, deliberate, unshaken. She didn't need to shout to command a room. Her composure was her weapon. Her truth was her shield. And when Miller unleashed his arrogance, she didn't flinch because she had faced arrogance in 1,000 other forms before. To the audience watching, she wasn't just another politician. She was a symbol of progress, of defiance, of possibility. She embodied a truth Miller could never erase. That the America he tried to shrink was bigger, stronger, and more diverse than his fear could ever contain. And that's why the silence before her first words carried so much weight. Because it wasn't just Jasmine Crockett sitting there. It was the future staring arrogance in the face. The silence had been Jasmine Crockett's opening weapon, but now the debate was beginning to boil. Stephen Miller leaned forward, eager to reclaim ground. His voice sharpened, rising with the confidence of someone who believed volume equaled authority. He peppered his statements with barbed jabs, twisting facts into weapons, trying to box Crockett into a corner. To his followers, this was vintage Miller, the attack dog, relentless and smug. But to everyone else, it reeked of desperation. "Congresswoman," he sneered, "your kind of thinking is exactly what weakens America." The words hung in the air like poison. Miller expected outrage, a stumble, a rise in Crockett's voice that he could exploit. But what he got instead was composure. Jasmine leaned back, measured him with a calm gaze, and replied, "What weakens America isn't compassion. It's arrogance dressed up as patriotism." The chamber stirred. Reporters' eyes flicked up. Miller's smirk faltered just for a moment. The tension built like a symphony, each note sharper than the last. Miller doubled down, raising his voice, interrupting, gesturing wildly. Crockett, in contrast, remained steady, her words deliberate, each line crafted to cut through his bluster. He mocked, she clarified. He exaggerated, she dismantled. And with each exchange, the imbalance grew clearer. The cameras captured every flicker of Miller's frustration. His interruptions became more frantic, his sneer more forced. He was trying to dominate, but Crockett was playing a different game. Not reaction, but revelation. Every time she answered, she exposed him, not just as wrong, but as hollow. The audience watching online could feel the shift. Chat rooms lit up. Tweets flew across timelines. She's cooking him alive. He doesn't know what to do. The battle had spilled out of the chamber and into living rooms across the nation. And then came the breaking point. Miller slammed his hand on the desk, his voice cracking with rage. "You don't understand the real America," he shouted. Crockett leaned in, her voice calm, unwavering. "No, Mr. Miller. I'm the real America. And that's why you're afraid." The room fell silent. For a split second, even Miller seemed stunned. It was the moment when arrogance met immovable truth and lost ground. But this wasn't the end. It was only the setup. Because what Jasmine Crockett was about to unleash would not just silence Miller. It would dismantle him. The pause before Jasmine spoke again was surgical. She let Miller's outburst hang in the air, let the audience sit in the discomfort of his words. And then, with the precision of a seasoned litigator, she began. "You speak of America as if it belongs to you alone. But America is not your inheritance to hoard. It's our collective promise to protect." Her voice was steady, her tone unwavering. The words struck like thunder, each syllable landing heavier than the last. Miller opened his mouth to interrupt, but Crockett didn't give him the chance. She pressed forward, stacking fact upon fact, story upon story. She spoke of families torn apart by policies he had championed, of children separated at borders, of communities forced to live in fear. And then she flipped it, turning his narrative inside out. "You call it patriotism. But stripping people of their humanity is not patriotism. It's cowardice." The chamber erupted in murmurs. Miller's face flushed red, his composure unraveling. He tried to interject, but every word out of his mouth sounded smaller now, weaker, drowned out by the momentum Crockett had seized. And then came the moment that would be replayed on every news channel, clipped into every viral thread. Crockett leaned forward, locked eyes with him, and delivered the line that shattered his facade. "You built your career on fear, Mr. Miller. But fear is fragile. And today, in front of this country, it just broke." The audience gasped. Reporters scribbled furiously. Miller sat frozen, his smirk gone, his mask slipping. For the first time, the so-called architect looked like the house of cards he truly was. Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't need to. Her words were the gavel. The debate wasn't just won, it was finished. And as she leaned back in her chair, the cameras caught a man who had been dismantled not by volume, not by rage, but by truth spoken with unshakable dignity. But the ripple effects were only beginning. Outside those walls, America was already reacting, and Miller's downfall was about to spread far beyond that room. The moment Jasmine Crockett delivered her final blow, the chamber froze. Stephen Miller sat stiff, his jaw tight, his silence louder than any rebuttal he could muster. But while the room held its breath, the world outside had already erupted. Within minutes, clips of the exchange flooded social media. Hashtags surged. Hashtag Crockett crushes Miller. Hashtag truth over fear. Hashtag real America speaks. Twitter timelines lit up with disbelief and celebration. She ended him in one sentence. "This is the America I want to see." I felt that in my soul. It wasn't just politics. It was a cultural moment, a collective exhale from millions who had grown tired of arrogance, parading as leadership. On TikTok, teenagers remixed Crockett's lines into edits layered with booming sound effects and flashing text. Fear is fragile. On Instagram, the still image of Miller's stunned face became a meme within hours, captioned, "When the truth finally hits." What had begun as a heated exchange in a single chamber was now a firestorm spreading across every digital platform, impossible to contain. The media, too, couldn't look away. Cable networks replayed the footage on loop, commentators dissecting every second. Some tried to salvage Miller's dignity, framing it as a spirited debate. But most agreed he had been dismantled. The New York Times called it a rhetorical knockout. MSNBC hailed Crockett as a rising star with unshakable poise. Even traditionally cautious outlets couldn't ignore the optics, arrogance collapsing under calm truth. Celebrities chimed in. Authors, actors and activists amplified the moment with their own reflections. "That's leadership," one wrote. "That's what courage looks like," posted another. The ripple effect was undeniable. Crockett's words had transcended politics and entered culture. She had become not just a congresswoman in a hearing, but a symbol of resistance, dignity, and hope. And for Stephen Miller, his silence became the story. For a man who thrived on commanding attention, his inability to respond carried more weight than any speech he could have given. Headlines didn't frame him as an opponent. They framed him as defeated. But the greatest shockwave wasn't in the memes or the hashtags or even the headlines. It was in the quiet reflection happening across kitchen tables and group chats. Ordinary people, immigrant families, young activists, weary workers, saw themselves in Jasmine Crockett's defiance. They felt validated. They felt seen. And in that validation, a new kind of power was born. The power of a nation reminded that dignity can still triumph over cruelty. What happened in that room would not stay contained. The echo was only beginning. And as the storm spread, one truth was clear. Stephen Miller had not just lost an argument. He had lost control of the narrative. When the dust settled, what lingered wasn't Miller's rage or even his silence. It was Jasmine Crockett's calm, deliberate dismantling of arrogance. In a political climate saturated with shouting matches and empty sound bites, her restraint stood out like a beacon. She didn't win by being louder. She won by being truer. And that mattered, because this was never just about one exchange in a hearing room. It was about the story America tells itself, about who belongs and who defines its future. Stephen Miller represented a shrinking vision of America, an America defined by exclusion, by fear, by walls both literal and imagined. Jasmine Crockett embodied the opposite, an America still unfinished but expanding, an America stitched together by courage, diversity, and dignity. Her words, "Fear is fragile," echoed beyond the chamber because they weren't just aimed at Miller. They were aimed at every person who had ever felt diminished by his brand of politics. They were aimed at families who had been forced to prove their worthiness again and again. They were aimed at young people growing up in a country where their existence was treated as a problem. In her defiance, they found validation. And the lesson was undeniable. Arrogance may dominate a room for a moment, but it cannot outlast truth. Miller's bluster crumbled because it had no foundation. Crockett's calm endured because it was built on something deeper, lived experience, moral clarity, and the kind of courage that doesn't waver under pressure. For the progressive audience watching, the moment was more than satisfying. It was affirming. It reminded them that dignity isn't weakness, that compassion isn't naivety, and that justice isn't a slogan but a struggle worth fighting for. It was proof that the voices too often silenced can still roar without ever raising their tone. And for the broader nation, it was a reminder of what leadership can look like when stripped of ego. Leadership is not sneering from pedestal. It is standing firm in the face of insult. It is refusing to shrink when someone tries to erase you. It is carrying the weight of a community on your shoulders and speaking with the kind of conviction that makes even your enemies pause. So, as headlines continue to swirl and clips continue to circulate, the moral of the story crystallized. Fear may shout, but dignity speaks louder. Arrogance may sneer, but truth stands taller. And when the two collide, history remembers not the sneer, but the courage that silenced it. Jasmine Crockett had not just won a debate. She had etched a moment into the national memory, a reminder that America is still being written and voices like hers are writing its future. And so, with one exchange, the narrative shifted. Stephen Miller walked into that room believing he would dominate, believing his sneer would silence. Instead, he left diminished, exposed, undone by the very arrogance he carried like armor. Jasmine Crockett, with calm precision and unshakable dignity, turned his performance into his downfall. But this story doesn't end in that chamber. It continues with us, with how we choose to remember, to share, to amplify. Because moments like these are more than entertainment. They are reminders that truth can still cut through noise, that courage can still topple arrogance, and that dignity, when wielded with clarity, is stronger than any insult. So here's the challenge. Don't just watch, be part of it. Share this story. Carry it into your conversations, your feeds, your communities. Let it remind you that progress isn't inevitable, but it is possible when voices like Jasmine Crockett's rise to meet fear head-on. If you felt the power of this moment, if you saw yourself in her defiance, then subscribe, stay with us, and keep this movement alive. Because arrogance will always try to return, but so will dignity. And in that battle, we know which side history remembers.